Welcome to the Euranet Plus network debate, the Citizen Corner, today here in Brussels in the Parliament. Let's take a look at ourselves. Our hands, our legs, they're hopefully function properly, but it can be a step, it can be a sign, it can be an announcement that's made through a loudspeaker, it can be a simple math equation. Those things seem really easy to us, but they might be a huge barrier for others. For example, for physically or mentally disabled people, for a deaf person or a blind person, we often forget that there are barriers, not only around us, but also in our heads. And that's why we're here today. We want to talk about how we can remove barriers here in Europe for people with disabilities. Here in Europe, 6% of the population have a disability. That's about 80 million people, roundabout. And of course, measures are being undertaken to improve the daily life and to decrease barriers. But what are the results and how effective have those measures been? I'm Ulrike Drevenstedt. I'm a member of the Euranet Plus network. I'm very happy to be discussing this topic with my guests today, which are, I'm going to start to my very left. Zuleika, you're a student from Spain and you're joining a student radio, and that's why you're here today.
Exactly.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Marianne Harking from Ireland, you're a member of the group of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats of Europe, and you have worked very hard in implementing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities.
Yeah, well, that's been one of my priorities during the last term, but really we were only getting started. The real work will be done this term, I hope.
Yeah,
I intend.
We will talk about,
Yes.
for example, the disability card and
Yes.
further on. To my right, Etienne Kusch. You're a member of the European Disabled Forum, which serves as an organization which helps people with disabilities and also their parents to get a voice. Did I say that right?
That's pretty right, yes. It's
Okay.
very much about representing persons with disabilities in Europe and being an interlocutor towards EU decision makers. And it's an organization of persons with disabilities. So it's really persons with disabilities themselves getting organized in an organization.
So from you, we will learn about maybe problems, current issues, and maybe also reform needs, and so on, right?
Yeah, sure.
Very great. And last but not least, Renate Weber, also a member of the Parliament from Romania. You're a member of the group of the European People's Party, and you've always worked for minorities, for women's rights, against discrimination.
Yes, my background is in human rights, and I have worked very much also on the rights of people with disability, but from the LIBE committee perspective during the last mandate, this term I've changed to the employment committee.
Okay, so we will also talk about that a little bit later on. Well, there are many treaties and also many reforms, also resolutions that have been made. For example, the Disability Action Plan by the Commission, or the resolution on mobility and inclusion. Of course, the treaty, the United Nations Treaty. There's the European Disability Strategy for the years of 2010 to 2020. We'll talk about that in detail too. Zuleika, you've brought a question that might get us started.
Okay. In many places, such as the streets, they're made with pedestrians in consideration only. No ramps, small sidewalks, no signs for the visually impaired, which all of this transcends into society and are example of both physical and discriminatory barriers. So my question to you is, why do you think that when designing these streets, people with disabilities aren't taken in consideration as much as people without them?
Feel free, whoever.
Okay, thank you. And what you brought up there is the practical day-to-day, people's lives every day. And that's what's, I think, really important because, you know, in this Parliament there are certain things we can do, and we'll get talking about the UN Convention, etc. But we're talking there about policy on a European level. What you're talking about is policy at a national level, at a regional level. I know one or two good examples, in fact, of towns and places that have a strategy in place place to ensure accessibility. In my own country, in Ireland, there's a town called Cavan Town, and they have really good strategies in place to do with accessibility on their footpaths, on signage, all of that. For example, yeah, on footpaths, on signage, on making sure that the town itself is accessible to persons with disability. As far as the European Parliament becoming involved in such, let's say, a programme, I mean, we have in Council at the moment a disability directive. Now, that's on the provision of goods and services. It's not quite the same thing, but nonetheless, that is stuck in Council at the moment, and we can't get agreement on it. But I do think that is the kind of practical, down-to-earth detail that we need to hear about and try to incorporate where we can in policy, because, as I said, it affects people's everyday lives.
Yes, it's no, you're totally right, but it's only part of the problem, because the truth is not only about how streets are, but how access, including to public institutions, are designed. And yes, indeed, it is a matter of national legislation and policy. Unfortunately, what you can see is that in some countries you do have quite good legislations, and there were also benchmarks decided on what to do until that date and that date. And the truth is that when you look in the reality, it's very little, and it's not because of the money. If you see how often all this work affect our daily life, it's not because of the money. I would say it's rather a sort of a negligence of lack of awareness regarding the needs of the people with disabilities. And for this, I dare to blame everybody, in the sense that it's very easy to point out to the authorities, but what we as citizens in the country are we doing, what the media is doing. Once in a while, yes, you do have articles or you have some TV shows, but then in a couple of days it disappears and it remains as it is in this moment. So I would say that much more must be done in this respect, and we should encourage, and including the European Commission through funds available to NGOs, we should encourage the NGOs that represent people with disabilities. I would like to see much more activity on their behalf, and to speak louder and to knock at everybody's doors and to knock at our conscience if possible.
It's very good to have you right here. Would you agree?
Thank you. I cannot agree more with the last sentence I heard from Mrs. Weber, and I fully agree that as a representative organization of persons with disabilities, we're in touch also with a lot of situations on the ground where we can really bring the perspective of persons with disabilities and expertise of how to solve problems and how public authorities can solve their problems. And it's clear that accessibility is a big issue, and I'm very happy that we're going really deep into a key topic here immediately. Accessibility is really a big issue. The situation is different between European countries. It's very different. In some countries, accessibility is very good. Built environment, streets can be accessible, or relatively accessible. In some countries, very, very bad. And there's definitely a big role here to play for Europe. For the moment, accessibility is regulated at national level or sometimes regional level, and some countries have strict legislation, some countries don't have strict legislation, and there's a key role for Europe here to harmonize this, harmonize to the top, harmonize to the good standard accessibility criteria. And we have a legislation now in the pipelines. It's in the pipelines in the Commission. It's been delayed for some years, the European Accessibility Act. And that's something that we as European Disability Forum has been calling for many years. And we are still waiting for the European Commission to publish a legislative proposal to a very, very important legislation which would really make a big difference for persons with disabilities in Europe in their everyday life, to have an accessible, not just environment, but also transport and services and so on. And just to be able to live as normal citizens and have equal rights, equal opportunities. Finally, I will also finish by saying that accessibility It's something very concrete. It's also a human right. It's being recognized as a human right, and it is a right, a fundamental right given by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We're talking about many treaties before. This one for us is very important. The EU and most member states are a party to this UN Convention, and accessibility is a key right inside it.
Can I just make one comment there about accessibility? Sure. I mean, we do have some European legislation on accessibility for public transport, for example. And in the last Parliament, we passed a report. We voted almost unanimously in the Parliament on a report on accessibility to public websites. And also in the structural funds, the social funds, the rural development funds. All of those funds are being rolled out now for the next 7 years. Again, contained within those funds are clauses about access for persons with disability as well as accessibility to the built environment. So insofar, I think, as it can, particularly with the use of its funds, the European Union is certainly trying to encourage and not just encourage, but insist that member states abide by that criteria. But it's only a small step, as many of my colleagues have said. A lot of this is national, and we need to do more to try to encourage member states.
Exactly. Right there, I have two questions. You said they're trying. Are they trying hard enough? Have enough efforts been made? You talked about web pages, for example. I think only 5% of them are barrier-free for everybody.
Yeah, well, public websites we're talking about here, accessibility of public websites. So, I mean, we're only at the start of that at the moment. But again, at least the initiative has come from the Commission and it's gone through the Parliament, and the Council has agreed. So we have to see how that works. But it is a start. I mean, it's just for public websites. We did try to extend it in the Parliament to all other websites, but unfortunately we weren't able to. But I suppose, in a way, it's just a start. And your question is, are member states trying hard enough? I think some are making real progress. I think there is no doubt about that. And I think it's also important to understand that different member states come from, different levels. But equally, for a person who has a disability listening to me, in any of the 28 member states, they are saying in their head right now, this is my life, this is my time, I don't get a second go at this. So a little bit here and a little bit there is not enough.
Correct. Renate Weber, maybe you can help us. How do you think could we create incentives to have member states oblige more?
Well, if we don't... Well, no, first of all, I would say that there should be incentives from within the country and also from outside the country. Both. I would prefer to see sort of like the authorities in the middle, we push from both sides and then they will move ahead. Why? Because, I take the example in my own countries. Regardless of the statistics, people think that, in fact, there are not so many people with these disabilities, not thinking that they are invisible because they don't get access in the streets, in the institutions, in the theaters, everywhere, to the workplaces, yeah? Once they would have this access, then they would become visible, and we would realize that the number of people is indeed pretty big, and maybe also the public opinion would actually push and ask for such things. But at the same time, I have to say that let's take a look also into how the women's rights and equal opportunities legislation have come to the current situation. It was always necessary to have also a push from the European Union side, and I totally support this. Why not? Let's have legislation. Countries that do not enforce correctly the legislation should be under impeachment. Yes, let's use every possible means and tools to get to the point where we would like to be for everybody.
So, talking about punishments as in sanctions, would you go that far?
Everything.
Okay.
Why not? I mean, as Marianne just said, people with disabilities say, I'm not going to have a second life. I need something during this life.
So you mentioned before that some reforms or ideas are stuck in council. How come, if we are all aware of the importance, how come still things take so long? You know, that
Well,
might
I
be the
suppose one of
feeling people
reasons
have.
Things take so long is because it's legislation for 28 member states,
Yeah.
and that in itself is something pretty substantial. And while the Parliament, it was 2008 actually, that's a long time ago, that's 6 years ago since we passed that directive. I think a number of member states are still objecting to certain aspects of it. It's my understanding, perhaps some of my colleagues here will know a little bit more about this, that the Italian presidency were going to try to see if they could do anything
And they're on
during
right
their
now.
term about, it's the Italian presidency right now. I don't actually know if they've made any progress on it. I just haven't checked that recently, but it's my understanding that they were trying to see if they could find a way of unblocking this in the council. So it is with the member states at this point. I think another point that's worth making, and this isn't to abrogate responsibility in any way, is that the EU can only act where the treaties give it a legal basis. In other words, there may be people out there saying, you know, why doesn't the EU do this or that? But actually, we don't have the power in some cases. I am not saying we do everything right. There's a lot more we can do. Etienne talked about the Accessibility Act. That's hugely important. We're still waiting. It'll be interesting to see if this current Commission are thinking in terms of bringing that forward. Perhaps you know a little bit more about that than I do. So there is a lot more we can do, but it's also, I think, important for people to understand that the EU can't just legislate where it likes, and that member states themselves have a lot of power and competence in this area.
Right.
And one of the examples of that is the fact that the anti-discrimination legislation on access to goods and services is stuck in council. So it's prime ministers of various member states that are holding this up.
Well, it's also a good thing that they can't act on everything. I guess we've had debates about how, you know, the EU interferes too much. You know, we've had that before, but let's not get into that. Do you know of a time frame we just talked about? That's the Accessibility Act. Is there a time frame? Or
We know that it will be for the new commission, but we want to see more concrete timelines. So we want to see a concrete timeline, and we hope that we will have some answer during the hearing of the commissioner designate that take place this week. We will see about that. But just to come back also to what Mein Harkin was saying about the EU has the possibility to do a lot, and the Parliament also did a lot. It is absolutely true that the Parliament has been pushing member states to have legislation on accessibility of website, and the Parliament has a very ambitious position. The Parliament has always been in favor of the European Accessibility Act, of the Equal Treatment Directive, to put accessibility and disability as condition in the structural funds. Parliament has always been pushing for that, and I really want to commend the MEPs who are here today and who've been really great supporters. And now a lot of things are stuck in the Council. I think the reason on whether the EU can act or not is not just the only reason, and sometimes it's not a good reason. There is also not enough awareness about the potential that better accessibility and better inclusion of persons with disabilities can bring. And there's also a thought at the moment, a fear that all this costs money, and with the economic crisis we hear this argument a lot. But the money is there. We have the structural funds. It's the second part of the EU budget. It's a lot of money that can be used smartly for inclusion, not for segregation. And we've seen that sometimes it is used to refurbish institutions segregating persons with disabilities.
so are you saying it's not used wisely enough?
It's not used wisely enough, absolutely. There's a lot of progress to be made to use this money smartly, the money that is there.
Okay. When talking about accessibility and participation, also in politics, we have a new guest here at the table. Irene from Spain, you work for the Young Journalists. And you've brought an example from your home country, which talks about a person with a disability who works in politics.
Exactly. I would like to focus the topic on political participation of people with mental disabilities, which I think they have more difficulties than just physically disabilities, maybe in that concrete area. In Spain, a girl with Down syndrome have recently become city councillor. She's just 30, she has Down syndrome, and she has started to work as administrative assistant in the local government. Then she promptly rises in the Popular Party list, and she became suddenly the first girl with mental disabilities who is a church in politics in Spain. It was a very mediatic case, and everybody take the chance to show how inclusive are the politics, as they have a member which has Down syndrome in their party. But in my opinion, it doesn't represent the whole situation of Spain.
It's just one example.
It's just one example, yes, one good example. But I mean, recent papers haven't found the statistics to compare between member states how they put in practice policies to inclusive people with disabilities. Have the EU asked the member states to collect more statistics in order to improve in that area?
Do you know about that?
No, I don't know about how they collect statistics, but what I want to say is that in this parliament, in this term, we have, I think, 4 or 5 colleagues this time. 3 I know in the EPP, people with disabilities. One with
A hearing impairment?
hearing, exactly. The other with the locomotor disability. Another one with some visual disabilities. And I know for sure that they are extremely involved. And I would be very interesting to listen to the hearings tomorrow, because tomorrow morning we will have the hearing of the commissioner, in whose portfolio actually this topic will be, and she will be obliged to deal with. So far, in what we have received from her office, I didn't see any emphasis on this subject, but maybe tomorrow things will be clarified. But I wanted to say something more in addition to that discussion, that things are stuck in the council, and I have asked for years now and supported my colleagues, and we asked together more transparency. No, not more transparency, full transparency.
Oh, that's a very good
exactly,
point.
that's the
what we
right
need.
word, exactly, full transparency. This is a union for their citizens, or it's not for government just to play games behind closed doors.
Sometimes
So
it feels like it.
doesn't feel it is like this, not only it feels. So I'd like to know exactly at every single moment who in the council is in favor of some action or he's opposing, and then of course the entire advocacy activity can be designed based on the information we have. And I am confident that this mandate would also bring some important changes in this respect, because we have a recent decision of the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg on transparency of documents.
Etienne, would you say that's a good step towards more inclusion, more rights, more possibilities?
Transparency is certainly very important. Transparency is very important, and to be honest, we EDF as a representative organization, we work at EU level. We like to work with the European Parliament. It's transparent. We work well with the European Parliament. Sometimes we have problem to work with the Council, and there's a duty, on a legal obligation, and on the European Union to work hand in hand with persons with disabilities and their representative organization in decision on disability. So certainly more transparency would be useful. To come back on political participation, we had one MEP identifying as a person with disability in the last term. Now we've got 5 or 6 maybe. That's indeed a big step. But out of 751 MEPs, there's still a long way to go to improve political participation. Just to come back to the very important figure, we have 80 million persons with disabilities in the EU. 80 million for 500 million citizens.
Every 6th person has a disability.
16%, yes.
Yes.
So for the European Parliament to be more representative, there's still a lot of work to do, to be done, not just at EU level, but of course also with political parties at national level and at local level to improve political participation for persons with disabilities. They also want to participate, to be actors to participate in the public life.
So now when we talk about politicians with a disability working as an MEP, for example, we got to take a step back, I think, which leads us to a whole new topic. It's education, and it's also training And here we are talking about inclusion in schools, inclusive learning, inclusive colleges, maybe even inclusive kindergartens. I know there's a lot that has been done in Germany. For example, I am from Germany. Every kid with a disability now has the right, at least in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, to attend a mixed school. And when I say mixed, I mean people with and without disabilities. In total, there are still a lot of schools for special needs, for children with special needs. Now, do you think inclusion is the way to go?
Well, the first comment, just before we come to that, about politicians and disability, the only comment I'll make is that there are 6 MEPs whose disability is visible. You may find that there are more MEPs who have a disability that is not visible, perhaps not as obvious. I don't know that to be the case.
We would like to know. We would like to know indeed.
Yeah, well, people may make choices about certain things, etc. So I'm just saying that, as you know yourself, not all disabilities are visible. But I still suspect that the percentage is not anything like the overall percentage in the general population. But that's just a comment I'd make. As far as your point, bringing it right back to education, to being involved in training to have possibilities for people. And I know in my own country as well, I can't speak for other member states because I'm just not familiar enough with the situation there, but the emphasis is more and more, I won't say exclusively, but heading in that direction on persons in mainstream classes. In other words, that there are not special schools unless the disability is so severe that it requires special assistance. But in general, no. And I know in Ireland the process is that within a classroom there may be classroom assistants, there may be what we call SNAs, special needs assistants, so that if a child, for example, may need assistance in various ways, anything from toileting to maybe their hands getting tired and they need a little bit of help with note writing, that those assistants will be available within the classroom. Now that's quite different from special education teachers, where the pupil may be withdrawn for a class or two to catch up maybe in language or in mathematics or whatever. So there is a significant push, especially in the last 10, 15 years, towards mainstreaming education for persons with disabilities. Even where the disability is quite profound. So I think, but I can't speak for other member states or what's happening there, but again, that helps inclusion, not just from the perspective of the person themselves, but just as crucially from the students around them, the people who are with them, who see them, who accept that they are the same as them, just different needs, that's all.
I think I have a good example right here. It's from a kindergarten in Germany. That's an exclusive kindergarten where kids learn and play together. There are kids who have to use a wheelchair. There are also kids who have a mental disability. And let's listen to one of the teachers from the kindergarten in Germany in North Rhine-Westphalia.
We
experience that the kids have very fine antennas. They realize very fast if another kid needs help. They're great in supporting each other. And we also experience a great acceptance among the kids.
Oh, and that's pretty much what you said, right? That's a great example.
Yeah, the children themselves, when they're young enough, that their opinions aren't already formed in many cases, that they just recognize they have different needs, but they're just like everybody else. And I think both of my colleagues here have been saying that it's as much about what goes in here in your mind, or what goes on here, how you think about things. And if you think in a certain way, then you're much more open, whether it's accessibility of the built infrastructure. In other words, it becomes part of what you do. And I know we haven't spoken about it yet, but and we will come to it. But I think this is what's going to be crucial about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that we, at least at European level, mainstream it, that it becomes part of what we do, that it's not an add-on. In other words, we don't look at a piece of legislation or whatever and say, oh yeah, when we're finished that now, we better look and check, does it comply with the convention? It needs to be integral to what we do.
How far has that process Ben,
Well, at the end of last term, I know within Employment and Social Affairs, I and some others were pushing that there would be at least one, if not two committees that would be responsible, and that they would perhaps have a subgroup to ensure that all legislation takes account of, and not even just takes account of, but that it becomes part of how people think when they're implementing legislation. And that has now been decided. I think, is it Libe is the other committee? I'm not sure, but certainly employment is the leader along with Libe. And then petitions is an associated committee where a specific petition relates to it. But again, I think, if I may say so myself, that's good policy making, it's intelligent policy making, so that it becomes part of what we do and not an add-on when we're nearly finished. Oh, don't forget about.
so even in policy making, we need to get rid of those barriers in the heads.
Absolutely,
I would say.
crucial, because, and we all have them. I have them. Certainly, I
Everybody
have
does
them.
probably.
Anyway. Yeah.
Yes. We talked about mainstream. Would you say that's the answer? Is that a demand you have of the European Disability
Yes,
Forum?
absolutely. Mainstreaming is really very, very important because disability is a cross-cutting issue. So there are matters being discussed in almost all committees of the European Parliament that can have an impact on the lives of persons with disabilities, and that's why mainstreaming, as Meinhagen was saying, is really crucial. And this cross-committee task force, you mentioned 2 or 3 committees being there. I think there might be 8 committees who want to be there, and we followed this issue a lot, EDF, in the last term, and we know that we had the support from a lot of committees and presidents of political groups to set up this new body inside Parliament for mainstreaming. And now it just needs to be put in place. And it's true that it will also help a lot to raise awareness inside the Parliament, also for the administration of the Parliament, also to take up the subject. Yeah, barriers are not just indeed physical, they are also attitudinal. It's about prejudices and stigma. And I cannot agree more with the fact that we were talking about inclusive education before, that it's not just good for students and pupils with disabilities, but also for other pupils and other students. It's good for everybody.
Now, we again have a new guest at the table. Welcome at the table. Anja from Croatia. You work for the student radio in Zagreb. And you have brought some information in which mainstream and inclusion isn't always seen as a good thing, right?
Yes, that's right. Well, taking in consideration that universities are actually very friendly and inclusive for people with disabilities, I would like to focus on a rather social aspect. During the conversation with my professor, she brought up a rather critical point of view. Actually, she said that one of the students with disabilities had no hesitation in utilization of his condition in order to provide better results for himself. So actually she realized that this young man used his disabilities in order to gain professors' sympathy, and in that way he would rapidly avoid hard work and any struggle which actually the other students who study hard also have. So my question is, should the professors and students also allow those who have difficulties or disabilities to pass easier than others, or should we rather treat them as everyone else and rate their work equally?
I can't
It is
believe
probably
this,
an
actually.
exception.
Yeah,
It is probably
because
an exception.
You have the example of a professor who I dare to say is very limited in her way of thinking, actually taking one example and generalizing, and it's absolutely incredible. I mean, in the academic world, you don't do this. I definitely am in favor of inclusion, of mainstreaming. It's good for the kids and students with disabilities, but it's good also for the others, because in one hand, yes, they do understand that apart from the fact that they have specific needs, we are all equal. And then they grow up with the ideas that some of our co-citizens, they have special needs, and we grow up with this idea that we have to provide something for giving them also equal opportunities. In what regards your question or your professor questions or your question, I would say that this depends very much on the type of disability. I mean, if we are talking about mental disability, then I think that yes, probably, but it's not something like people would like, you know, to overcome all these prejudices and stereotypes. Uh, Everybody should work harder, in fact, because the idea that, oh, but now we have all these positive discrimination. I have heard this on so many other occasions and instances. This is not necessarily the case. If you want to speak about the rights of somebody, you want to protect and you want to have equal opportunities, some people need more attention to get to those equal opportunities. This is about, I think.
So in order to fulfill that, we need more help for teachers. We need social workers,
we need
maybe.
trainings for everybody.
Exactly.
Not only
It's
for
not
the
only
children,
the disabled.
but also for the professors, yes.
Exactly.
Just a comment on that. I mean,
Sure.
I agree with Renata. This is a specific example, and this may well be quite accurate in that specific example. But then to extrapolate from that it's in some way a general situation is just not, I think, reasonable or accurate.
Absolutely not.
But there may be.
We need to be critical.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was
But
going
it's
to
a
say
reality,
that.
Marianne. Yes.
Pardon?
It's not correct, but it is a reality.
Correct.
Yes,
People think
absolutely.
This way.
But equally, I mean, that there are two issues here. If somebody has the ability to do something and they are trying to get away with doing less work, yeah, well, then that's up to the professor to deal with it. But you also have to recognise that, I know, again, I can only speak with experience, I suppose, about my own member state in education, because I was a teacher before I became a member of the parliament, that there are facilities during exams, for example, for students who have difficulty with writing or comprehension or whatever, that there are, you know, there is assistance available to those students, but it's in line with their disability and, you know, whatever their special needs are. So it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all. And yes, I'm sure there are one or two people out there who try and do the system. You find people who try and do the system everywhere, but you can't extrapolate from that you have to change the system. You got to deal with that situation in its own right.
Properly, hopefully. We have a lot of comments and a lot of interest going on in our social media, on Twitter and on Facebook. Lisa, thanks for checking it for us. What are comments that are being made on Facebook?
Yeah, I have one. Can you hear me? Can you all
Yes.
hear me?
Yes.
That's good. We have Adriana, a girl from Romania, and she's seeing the EU in a role of, somehow a big brother who should watch the national states in this case. And she has written us on our Facebook page, and she says there are a lot of laws about disabilities, but the laws really effective are only a few. European Union is very careful about money, so maybe it should control more member states on the implementation of laws regarding disability. Yeah, that's
Thank
the
you
question.
very much. Of course, it all comes back to the money. It's always a financial issue.
It's pretty much in line with what I said.
That's what you
that
said.
I want also to
Sanctions,
see also
punishments,
a supervision from here, and when it's necessary, yes, including a sanction. But the purpose of the sanction is to make something right. So this is what we all hope
But
for.
it brings our legislation into disrepute if we cannot find a way of ensuring that it is implemented.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think if you think in terms of 28 member states and quite a bit of legislation, it's impossible for the Commission to follow up maybe every single incident. I know from my experience with the Commission, I'm sure yours is the same, Renata, that if you go to the Commission with a complaint about something, it doesn't matter what it is, but what they will say is this repeated? Is it systemic? Is it going on, you know, all the time? Because if they were to take every single example of where a member state doesn't precisely implement European legislation, they would never be out of the courts and the Commission would have to be 10 times the size it is. So that's what they need to see, and that's what their responsibility is, because the Commission, you know, they're the guardians of the treaty. So if we have in member states still, you know, systemic violations and of a
Which they are.
a fairly serious nature, well then, and I know in many cases the Commission does follow up. Now, Renata or Etienne might know more about that than I do about specific examples where they have followed up.
The Commission certainly cannot follow everything, it's true, and hence the importance of having really strong enforcement bodies once you set up legislation. And for us also to make sure that legislation really address the needs of persons with disabilities on the ground, when it's implemented, it's very important also that it's being implemented together with persons with disabilities and their representative organization, that they can be there in the enforcement bodies or to see if it works or not, and to be able to sometimes pass on messages if it doesn't work, and sometimes also have access to remedies if needed. All this is very important. It's one aspect also that is being discussed in the legislation on access to websites, the enforcement body, and something that we are always asking very heartily.
We heard that our follower from Romania said "Big Brother." Of course, that's a term we don't really like, especially with all that, NSA stuff going on. But maybe media does play a key role in that whole, I don't want to say Big Brother situation, but in that situation where it might act as a supervisor or might help the politics to, work on it, maybe push things. Anja, you brought another question. Maybe you want to bring it up.
Actually, it's about media sector, which also has a key role in helping to include and implement various aspects for people with disabilities. So I'm asking you if you could explain how the media can positively affect on this problem and report about this issue in the right way.
Now, what's the connection between media and disability in Europe?
Well, I think Renata has already spoken about the role that media has to create awareness. We all have a role. One of the things I've seen, again, I'm just coming back to my own country, Ireland, is where in recent years, with all the cuts and austerity, etc., particularly the cuts to services for persons with disability, that has been highlighted in the media. And, there have been a number of campaigns where certain cuts have been reversed, etc. So, but I suppose while that's very useful and very important, we also need some kind of awareness within the media. It's not just what the media says, it's what the media does. How many persons with disability do you find in the media, up front, visible? We talk about the Parliament, and our record mightn't be all that great, but how many people are visible within the media?
It's a branch that needs to think about
it. But they also play a role about informing. And certainly I see in Ireland that they have taken on that role to some extent at least. But they should also be pushing the barriers, because sometimes the rest of us don't think outside the box in the way we should. And I think they should push those barriers again and again and challenge us.
Probably the main role they should be taking.
At the same time, I would say that we also should bring people from the media closer to the topics. I'm thinking, for example, that here in the Parliament there is also this intergroup of the people with disabilities, probably one of the oldest in the Parliament. And although right now, for example, it is chaired by a person who is a person with disabilities, the truth is that many members are MEPs who do not have at least visible disabilities. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should invite more people from the media, from each member state, to come, to understand, to see the debates, to have the possibility to meet people, to raise questions, to understand better, and then to have also expectations from themselves, because as far as I know, in those schools, of journalistic schools, they do not learn about these issues.
So there needs to be more interaction.
Exactly.
Can I just make a
running out of time?
Okay, it'll be a very quick comment.
Okay,
let's go. Every 2 years we have an event in Strasbourg, and where people with disabilities from all over the EU come to speak to MEPs, etc. And during the last event, they were a bit disappointed with the representation. Now, there were quite a few MEPs there, but still, they wanted to get their message across to everybody. So I think that the next time out, which is a year from now, roughly, we should make every effort to try and get as many MEPs there as possible, just to listen for a half an hour, not to talk, to listen, to get some concept of what people's lives are really like. Because when you don't have that experience yourself, you don't know what's happening. And this is called the Freedom Drive. And I think it's a great event, but if it's limited to just a few MEPs and the people who are already working in this area, then it doesn't quite have the same impact. And I think we have a responsibility on that one.
So we can probably say
the
that
Freedom Drive is really important.
Next year, Strasbourg.
Yes.
So we can probably say that more interaction needs to be done in order to raise awareness on both sides, on the media side and on the political side, maybe even on the side of people with disabilities. The forum does that, right, to create a voice, to create awareness, to try to combine different medias. I want to give you the last word because we're running out of time. Maybe you just voice what's the importance of that.
It's very important. I mean, for us, awareness raising and we did many campaigns to raise awareness. It's very important. The role of the media to raise awareness about disability issues is crucial indeed. I mean, citizens follow public affairs thanks to the media also partly, but those media also needs to be accessible to persons with disabilities. So don't forget about the accessibility. Videos without subtitle will not work for deaf persons, so or hard of hearing persons as well. So you need to make media accessible. Also, that's also one precondition for the role of the media to be very strong and to help raising awareness.
So I think the main thing we can sum up with is we need to remove those barriers in our heads. We need to remove those physical barriers, and maybe we are a step closer after today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining the discussion at Euranet Plus Network. Thank you.